Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video number 11 of the playlist, we'll talk about Freud thoughts on the topic, a level within the ego. Curious? Let's begin. If, bearing in mind the mutually supplementary descriptions of authors writing about mass psychology, one casts a general look at the life of the individual person today, one may, faced with the complications that emerge here, be discouraged from offering a comprehensive account. Each individual is a component of many masses, has ties in many directions as a result of identification, and has built up his I ideal on the basis of a wide variety of models. Each individual thus has a share in many mass minds, those of his race, his class, his religious community, his nationality, etc., and may also, beyond that, rise to a certain amount of independence and originality. With their steady continuity of effect, these constant, long-lasting mass formations are less in evidence than the rapidly formed transitory masses on the basis of which Le Bon outlined his brilliant psychological description of the mass mind. Yet it is in these noisy, ephemeral masses that are, so to speak, superimposed on the others that the miracle occurs whereby what we have just acknowledged as individual development disappears without trace, albeit only temporarily. Our understanding of that miracle is that the individual surrenders his I ideal, exchanging it for the mass ideal embodied in the leader. The miracle, we might add by way of qualification, is not equally great in every case. In many individuals, separation of I and I ideal is not very far advanced. The two can still easily coincide. The I has often retained its earlier narcissistic satisfaction with itself. The choice of leader is greatly facilitated by this circumstance. Often the leader need only possess the typical properties of such individuals in a particularly pure and well-defined form, and give an impression of greater strength and libidinal freedom. The need for a powerful head will then do the rest, investing the leader with the superior might to which he would perhaps not normally be entitled. Others whose respective I ideals would otherwise not have found embodiment in his person uncorrected are then swept along by suggestion, that is to say, as a result of identification. We realize that the contribution we have been able to make towards explaining the libidinal structure of the mass comes down to drawing a distinction between I and I ideal, and to the dual type of attachment, identification and insertion of the object in place of the I ideal, made possible as a result. The assumption of such a level in the I as a first step in analyzing the I must eventually demonstrate its justification in the most varied areas of psychology. In my essay on the introduction of narcissism, I collected together all the pathological material that, at the time, could be used in support of such a separation. However, its importance may be expected to turn out to be very much greater the more work is done on the psychology of psychoses. Let us not forget that the I now enters into the relationship of an object to the I ideal that has developed from it, and that possibly all the interactions between external object and total I with which we have become familiar in neurosis theory are repeated on this new stage within the I. Here I want to look into only one of the conclusions possible from this standpoint, and thus continue discussing a problem that I had to leave unresolved elsewhere. Each of the mental distinctions that have become known to us has the effect of making the mental function more difficult, increasing its fragility, and potentially triggering a failure of that function, i.e., an illness. Thus, in being born, we took the step from utterly self-sufficient narcissism to perception of a changeable outside world and the beginning of object finding, and associated with that is the fact that we do not permanently tolerate the new state, that we periodically undo it, and in sleep return to the previous state of dullness and object avoidance. In this we are of course obeying a hint from the outside world, which through the periodic change from day to night temporarily deprives us of most of the stimuli affecting us. The second example of greater importance to pathology is subject to no such restriction. In the course of our development, we have separated our mental stock into a coherent I and an unconscious repressed part left outside the I, and we are aware that the stability of this fresh acquisition is exposed to constant bombardment. In dream and in neurosis, this excluded part knocks at the gates guarded by inhibitions, asking to be admitted, And in wakeful health, we make use of special tricks to bypass those inhibitions and, experiencing pleasure, temporarily admit that repressed part into our I. Jesting and humor, and to some extent the comic generally, may be seen in this light. Similar instances of lesser consequence will occur to every expert on the psychology of neuroses, but I want to move on swiftly to the desired application. It would be quite conceivable that separation of the I ideal from the I is also not tolerated on a permanent basis and must occasionally regress. Despite all the renunciations and restrictions placed upon the I, periodic breaching of the bands is the rule. This is shown by the institution of feasts. Originally, feasts were quite simply excesses ordained by law. In fact, they owe their joyful character to this liberation. The Romans' Saturnalia and our present-day carnival have this key feature in common with the feasts of primitives, which tend to result in every kind of dissipation, with what are normally the most sacred rules being flouted. But the I ideal comprises the sum total of all the restrictions that the I should observe. So retraction of the ideal would inevitably be a splendid celebration for the I, which might then once again be happy with itself. There is invariably a feeling of triumph when something in the I coincides with the I ideal. Guilt feelings and the sense of inferiority can also be seen as expressions of the tension between I and ideal. There are people, as everyone knows, whose general mood fluctuates periodically from excessive dejection through a certain in-between condition to an exalted sense of well-being. Such fluctuations occurring in very different degrees of amplitude from the barely noticeable to the sorts of extreme that is melancholia and mania constitute very painful or disturbing intrusions in the life of the person concerned. In typical cases of such cyclical depression, external causes do not appear to play a decisive role, while internal motives are found in no greater number and in no different a form in such patients than in anyone else. It has therefore become customary to assess such cases as non-psychogenic. We shall be looking later at other very similar cases of cyclical depression that, however, can easily be traced back to mental traumas. In other words, the reason for these spontaneous fluctuations of mood is not known. We lack an understanding of the mechanism by which melancholia is replaced by mania. That would make these the patients for whom our supposition might hold good, namely that their I ideal has temporarily disappeared into the I, having previously ruled with a special severity. Let us be quite clear about this. There is no doubt, on the basis of our analysis of the I, that in the manic I and I ideal have come together, with the result that the person, in a mood of triumph and self-satisfaction, untroubled by self-criticism, is able to delight in the removal of inhibitions, consideration for others, and self-reproach. It is less evident but nonetheless highly probable that the misery of the melancholic expresses a sharp conflict between the two authorities within the I, in which the oversensitive ideal bluntly exposes its condemnation of the I in delusions of insignificance and in self-abasement. The only question is whether the cause of these altered relations between I and I ideal should be sought in the periodic rebellions against the new institution postulated above, or whether different circumstances should be held responsible. The abrupt switch to mania does not inevitably feature among the symptoms of melancholy depression. There are simple single and also regularly recurring melancholias that never suffer such a fate. On the other hand, there are melancholias in which the occasion clearly plays an ideological role. These are the ones following the loss of a loved object, whether through the death of the same or as a result of circumstances necessitating the withdrawal of libido from the object. Such a psychogenic melancholia can equally well turn into mania, and this cycle be repeated a number of times, as is the case with an apparently spontaneous one. In other words, the circumstances are somewhat obscure, particularly since only a few forms and cases of melancholia have hitherto been subjected to psychoanalytical investigation. Up to now, we understand only those cases in which the object has been abandoned after showing itself unworthy of love. It is then re-erected in the I through identification and judged severely by the I ideal. Reproaches and aggression against the object come to light as melancholy self-reproach. The descent into mania can follow this kind of melancholia too. This eventuality constitutes a trait that owes nothing to the other characteristics of the syndrome. However, I see no difficulty in having the fact of the periodic rebellion of I against I ideal taken into consideration in respect of both types of melancholia, the psychogenic and the spontaneous. In the latter case, it can be assumed that the I ideal tends to display a special severity, which then automatically leads to its temporary neutralization. In psychogenic melancholia, the I would be prompted to rebel as a result of the sort of ill treatment on the part of its ideal that it experiences in the event of identification with a discarded object. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check the books available in our link in the description. There, you'll find many fundamental marketing books in different languages. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more psychology-related content. See you in the next one.